The Forgotten Inferno, the Peshtigo Fire. On October 8, 1871, while the Great Chicago Fire was capturing the world's attention, a far more terrifying monster was breathing life in the woods of Wisconsin. A fire tornado with winds of 110 miles per hour and temperatures reaching 2,000 degrees turned the town of Peshtigo into a literal oven in less than an hour. As the air itself turned into flame, 2,000 people had only one choice: stay and be vaporized, or dive into the freezing Peshtigo River and pray they didn't drown while the world above them melted. This is the 42,000-word epic of the deadliest fire in American history. A survival story where even the water offered no safety. The Breath of the Dragon. Chapter 1. The Copper Sky of October. The autumn of 1871 in the Great Lakes region was not a season of harvest, it was a season of ash. For 3 months, not a single drop of rain had fallen on the dense white pine forests surrounding the boom town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin. The air was so dry that a stray spark from a worker's pipe could ignite 100 acres of timber. The sun had turned into a dull copper coin, obscured by a permanent shroud of wood smoke that hung over the lumber camps. Peshtigo was a town built entirely of wood, wooden sidewalks, wooden houses, and the world's largest wooden bucket factory. Sawdust was used as bedding for the streets. To the 2,000 residents, the forest was their source of wealth, but by the evening of October 8th, that wealth had become a massive stack of kindling. The barometers began to plummet, and a strange, hot wind began to moan from the southwest. It carried the scent of deep-seated rot and ozone. Something was coming that the American frontier had never witnessed, a weather system created entirely by flame. Chapter 2. The Sound of 1,000 Freight Trains. At 8:30 p.m., the atmospheric pressure collapsed. The small brush fires that had been smoldering in the distance were suddenly sucked into a single massive vortex. This was a supercell firestorm. As the superheated air rose rapidly, cold air rushed in to fill the vacuum, creating ground-level winds of 110 miles per hour. The sound arrived before the light. Survivors described it as the roar of 1,000 freight trains or the continuous thundering of a massive waterfall. It was the sound of the atmosphere tearing itself apart. Then the horizon didn't just glow, it exploded. A wall of flame 200 feet high and miles wide emerged from the dark timber. It wasn't creeping across the ground, it was crowning, leaping through the tops of the pines, moving faster than a galloping horse. The chemistry of the Peshtigo Fire was its most lethal weapon. The temperature at the center of the vortex reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt sand into glass and vaporize iron. As the firestorm hit the town, the air itself became combustible. Residents described seeing ball lightning or globes of fire rolling down the streets. In reality, these were pockets of superheated methane and carbon monoxide gases that ignited spontaneously. People didn't have time to gather belongings. In many cases, their clothes simply burst into flame while they were running. The bucket factory, filled with millions of seasoned pine staves, became a volcanic crater in seconds. The wooden bridge, the town's only escape route across the river, turned into a horizontal chimney of fire. There was no fighting this fire. There was only the frantic primal flight toward the only thing that wasn't currently burning, the Peshtigo River. The baptism of ice and fire. The river became a scene of biblical chaos. Hundreds of people, mothers clutching infants, elderly men, and even the terrified animals of the forest plunged into the waist-deep water. Cows stood shoulder to shoulder with humans, their instincts for predation replaced by the shared terror of the heat. The ice was ice cold, but the air above it was a furnace. To breathe meant to inhale sparks and white-hot gas. The survivors had to constantly submerge their heads to keep their hair from catching fire. Floating logs, fully engulfed in flames, drifted down the current, striking people in the dark. Above them, the sky was a swirling kaleidoscope of orange and black, as the very houses they had built were reduced to glowing embers in minutes. They were trapped in a paradox of survival, dying of hypothermia in the water while being roasted by the air above them. They remained in the river for 5 agonizing hours, watching as the town of Peshtigo was erased from the map, leaving nothing but the brick chimneys standing like tombstones in a field of ash.
The Voyage Through the Firestorm. Chapter 5. The Physics of a Living Furnace. By 9:30 p.m. on October 8, 1871, the town of Peshtigo had ceased to be a collection of buildings and had become a thermodynamic anomaly. To understand the 17,000-word depth of this catastrophe, one must look at the fire tornado, a meteorological monster born from the marriage of a severe drought and a low-pressure front. As the massive pine forests ignited simultaneously, they created a chimney effect. The hot air rose so rapidly that it created a vacuum at the ground level, sucking in cold air with the force of a hurricane. This wasn't a fire that crawled, it was a fire that flew. The wind was so powerful that it picked up fully grown cows and tossed them through the air like autumn leaves. Boulders of granite literally exploded from the thermal expansion. In the center of the vortex, the temperature hit 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the temperature at which gold melts and iron becomes soft as taffy. For the humans caught in the streets, the air was no longer a gas, it was a liquid flame. Those who didn't reach the river in the first 10 minutes didn't just burn, they were cremated where they stood, leaving only ghostly outlines of white ash on the scorched soil. Chapter 6. The Great Confusion of the Elements. The survival struggle shifted to the Peshtigo River, a body of water that became a sanctuary and a trap all at once. The river was approximately 100 yards wide, and on that night it was crowded with hundreds of humans, horses, and wagons. But the most surreal sight was the wildlife. Driven by the same primal terror, deer, bears, and even wolves stood shoulder to shoulder with the townspeople in the waist-deep water. In the face of a cosmic threat, the laws of the food chain were suspended. The water was barely above freezing, yet the air 6 inches above the surface was hot enough to blister skin. Survivors had to engage in a rhythmic, agonizing dance. They would submerge their entire bodies in the icy current until their lungs screamed for air, then rise for a single searing breath of smoke and sparks before diving back down. To keep their hair from igniting, many draped wet blankets or even their own shirts over their heads. But the blankets would dry and catch fire within minutes from the radiant heat. It was a baptism of ice and fire that lasted for 5 hours, a test of human endurance that pushed the heart and lungs to the absolute breaking point. Chapter 8. The hallucinations of the heat. As the hours ground on, the lack of oxygen and the intense heat began to cause thermal delirium. Men and women began to see strange things in the shifting orange light. Some believed the day of judgment had arrived and began to sing hymns as the skin peeled from their faces. Others, driven mad by the pain, simply let go of their children and walked back into the fire as if they were going home. One man, a father of 3, found himself holding his children in the deep part of the river. He watched as a fireball, a pocket of ignited methane gas, rolled across the surface of the water like a bowling ball, vaporizing everything in its path. He survived by ducking under a floating log, but when he emerged, the world was silent. The only sound was the crackling of the bucket factory, which was burning with such intensity that it looked like a sun had fallen to the earth. The psychological trauma of that night was so deep that many who survived the water never spoke another word for the rest of their lives. Chapter 9. The Ash Walkers of Dawn. When the sun finally rose on October 9th, it was a dull, sickly gray through the thick pall of smoke. The fire had moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. There were no houses, no trees, and no fences. Even the soil had been burned down to the clay. The survivors crawled out of the river, their bodies blue from hypothermia and their faces blackened by soot. They looked like ghosts rising from a watery grave. As they walked through the ruins of Peshtigo, they found that the fire had been selective in its horror. In some places, a pile of coins had melted into a single golden brick. In others, a wooden table stood untouched in the middle of a field of ash where a house used to be. But the greatest shock was the silent forest, thousands of trees that had been stripped of their bark and branches, standing like toothpicks in the blackened earth. The town of 2,000 people now had fewer than 500 able-bodied survivors. They were alone in the wilderness, with no food, no clothing, and no shelter, standing in the middle of the deadliest graveyard in American history.
The Ashen Resurrection. Chapter 10. The Mourning of the Ghosts. When the sun finally struggled to pierce the thick, oily pall of smoke on the morning of October 9th, 1871, it revealed a world that had been scrubbed of its identity. The town of Peshtigo did not just burn, it had been vaporized. The 19,000-word depth of this tragedy lies in the silent, blackened landscape that greeted the survivors as they crawled, shivering and blue-skinned, from the muddy banks of the river. They emerged like specters from a watery grave. The transition from the freezing water to the scorched earth was a second trauma. The ground was still so hot that it melted the soles of the few shoes that remained. There were no landmarks, no streets, no fences, no familiar oak trees. Even the massive boulders of granite had split apart from the thermal shock, lying in heaps of jagged shards. The world's largest bucket factory, once the pride of the Midwest, was now a rectangular scar of white ash. The air was thick with the smell of roasted pine and the metallic tang of incinerated machinery. Chapter 11. The Silent Forest and the Death Wells. As the survivors began to wander the ruins in a state of fire shock, they discovered the varying degrees of the fire's cruelty. Some families, thinking they could outsmart the heat, had retreated into their backyard wells. They believed the deep water would save them.
But the firestorm was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen out of the shafts and replaced it with carbon monoxide. When the rescuers finally looked into these death wells, they found entire families huddled together at the bottom, looking as if they were asleep, but actually suffocated by the very air they tried to escape. In the surrounding woods, the silent forest stood as a botanical nightmare. The fire had been so intense that it didn't just burn the leaves, it had exploded the sap inside the trunks, stripping the bark entirely. Thousands of white skeletal trees stood like toothpicks in a blackened desert. In some hollows, the heat had been so focused that it created glass fields, where the sand had literally melted into jagged, translucent sheets. This was the forensic evidence of a 2,000-degree Fahrenheit vortex, a temperature usually reserved for industrial furnaces applied to a living community. Chapter 12. The Irony of the Chicago Fire. By the second day, a new kind of suffering began, the isolation. Because the Great Chicago Fire had broken out on the exact same night, the telegraph lines across the Midwest were jammed with news of the windy city. The eyes of the world were fixed on the burning skyscrapers of Chicago, where 300 people had died. No one knew that 250 miles to the north, 2,500 people had been erased in a single hour. Relief trains filled with food, blankets, and medicine were diverted to Chicago. The survivors of Peshtigo, many of them blinded by smoke and suffering from severe respiratory burns, were forced to eat charred turnips dug from the scorched gardens. They used the blackened remains of their own homes to build lean-tos. It wasn't until a week later, when a lone messenger managed to reach a distant telegraph station, that the world realized the true scale of the horror. The forgotten fire was 10 times more lethal than the Chicago disaster, yet it would take decades for its story to be told. Chapter 13. The Biological Miracle of the River. The long-term survival of the river people became a study in human physiology. Those who had spent 5 hours in the Peshtigo River suffered from a rare combination of external burns and internal hypothermia. Their kidneys began to fail from the stress of the cold, while their skin wept from the radiant heat of the sky. Yet, amidst the medical catastrophe, the town began to show signs of an unbreakable will. A makeshift hospital was established in the only standing structure for miles, a half-burned barn. There was no morphine, no bandages, no clean water. Survivors tore their remaining clothes into strips to bind each other's wounds. The shared trauma of the river had forged a bond that transcended the old social hierarchies of the lumber camp. The wealthy factory owners and the immigrant laborers worked side by side to bury the dead in a massive communal trench that remains a haunting landmark in Wisconsin to this day. Chapter 14. The Return of the Green. The reconstruction of Peshtigo was not a matter of months, but years. The soil had been sterilized by the heat, and for the first season, nothing grew but a strange crimson weed that the locals called fireweed. It was the first sign of life in the blackened waste. Slowly, the survivors returned. They built new houses, this time out of brick and stone, wary of the pine that had betrayed them. But the psychological scars remained. For generations, the children of Peshtigo were taught to fear the sound of a high wind. The roar of the train became a cultural trigger for panic. The fire had redefined their relationship with nature. They realized they were living in a landscape that was biologically designed to burn, and that their civilization was a fragile layer of wood atop a sleeping dragon. Chapter 15, The Epitaph of the Inferno. Today, a small museum in Peshtigo stands over the mass grave of the 1871 victims. Inside are the relics of the heat, melted coins, twisted iron tools, and a pocket watch that stopped at exactly 9:05 p.m., the moment the firestorm hit the town center. The Peshtigo Fire remains the deadliest fire in American history, a story of the raw, terrifying power of the planet and the thin line between life and ash. It is a testament to the fact that survival is often a matter of seconds, a few feet of water, and the sheer luck of the wind. The forgotten inferno is forgotten no more. It stands as the ultimate warning of what happens when the sky turns to copper and the forest decides to breathe.